Ew. Hi, everyone. This is Sinead Whelehan, and it is November 2022. Time does fly. I'm here with my friend, Barbara Lamb, and all of you know Barbara Lamb very, very well. Today is the beginning of something that Barbara and I have started together, and we're temporarily, casually calling it, or I am anyway, calling it Barbara Lamb School, because Barbara and I have chats just together, the two of us, and we talk about a lot of different things. And the other day we were talking about death, and we were talking about what that means now, that death has changed a great deal in our collective understanding in terms of consciousness. And then Barbara started talking about how she was thinking about her life, and she was thinking about how she still feels like she has so much to do and so much to tell and to share with the audience. And so we kind of decided to do a series of talks in which Barbara will be sharing her knowledge and her experience, which is limitless practically, on many topics. And that we're going to make it nice and conversational style, casual for everyone. But we know that there's an audience out there that is really wanting to hear more from Barbara and about what she knows. So this is day one of Barbara Lamb School, and the theme is death. And that does not mean that it's a scary or bad or sad conversation. We believe actually the complete opposite, don't we, Barbara, about what death
Yes,
is? Yes.
yes, indeed.
Do
We
you want to
certainly,
start with what you think it is, Barbara?
well, first of all, I grew up in a family, um, a Protestant Christian family, and there wasn't much talk about death or what happens after physically dying. And I know that my parents, if they ever did talk about it at all, which was very, very rare, they would say things like, "Oh, I hope that there is something after we physically die."
Mm-hmm.
There's some sort of awareness. So that's the most that I ever had introduced to me about that subject. So in 1968, when I was in my um, early adult years, um, I had moved to California from Connecticut. And one evening I was sitting in my living room reading a magazine, and just very peaceful. My husband was away for the weekend, and my children were in bed in the other rooms. So it was just a nice time to relax and be at ease, just be by myself. And suddenly, while reading this magazine, I felt a sort of a sense that somebody was there, a feeling of presence. And I looked up from my magazine. I looked across the room, about 8 or 10 feet away. And there, sitting in an easy chair, was my favorite aunt who had died 2.5 years earlier.
Wow.
So I was totally shocked and amazed, because I had just never thought that there was such a thing as people doing spirit visitations. But here she was, my favorite aunt, whom I knew very well and loved a lot and felt loved by her. And she was sitting there looking completely three-dimensional and physical, technicolor. And so I was really surprised and delighted in a way, because it was not very nice to be visited by her. But I thought, how can this be? Because she died. I know she died. I went to her funeral two
Mm-hmm.
and a half years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just don't understand. So this experience went on for, I'd say, at least 5 or 6 minutes, maybe more even. And I was just sitting there on my sofa, looking across at her in the easy chair and noticing all the details about her hair, her silver rimmed glasses, her blue eyes, her one of her favorite blue dresses, and a particular favorite brooch that she wore, and the ring on her finger that she always wore, her shoes. And she was just sitting there exactly the way that she used to sit in our home as I was growing up, just sitting there looking very contented, very peaceful. She wasn't saying anything to me. She wasn't smiling or anything. She just was looking at me in a very, very pleasant way, very comfortable. But in the meantime, I was really going through all kinds of freaking out because I had just never heard of such a thing before.
Right.
Mind went to things like, well, since she died, and but yet she's here right now, this must mean that she's a ghost. And I've never believed in ghosts. So what is this? I had never heard of spirit visitations before that time either. And so I was totally mystified. And gradually, over the few minutes, my heart began to really pump like mad. And I kept saying to myself, come on, now calm down. This is benign. There's nothing dangerous. Yeah, but what is this? You know, and so my heart gradually just got to be beating so fast and hard that I thought I might have a heart attack. And I, wasn't ready to have a heart attack, that's for sure. I wasn't feeling any pain, but my heart was really, really revving up. So I thought, I've got to end this somehow. And so I just sort of took my magazine I'd been reading and shuffled it and put it on the table next to me and sort of changed my position and wiggled around a little bit. And then when I looked over at that chair again where she had been, I didn't see her anymore. But I must have sat there for at least an hour afterwards, just woo, going over and over that in my mind that it really happened. And it really happened, didn't it? I mean, it wasn't just my imagination. So, anyway, that was a real opener for me about the fact that after we die, we do continue and that we can even visit our loved ones here and let that loved one know that we're visiting. So there was so much about that experience that was new and absolutely amazing to me.
Wow, and absolutely out of
Well,
nowhere.
I was really inspired and mystified and a little bit troubled because I just had not had any concept of that before. And nobody I knew was talking about it. So, as I said, we had recently moved to California from across the country, and I didn't really have friends yet. We were so newly here. And so I never talked to anybody, and I didn't tell my husband about it after he returned because I knew that he would probably scoff at it and wouldn't believe it. And so I just never mentioned it for 4 whole years.
Wow.
I kept this private within myself.
But
And then,
were you doing any research though? I mean, when you had this experience, you sat there for an hour, you're in shock, you're trying to process it. Then what? Did you start reading books or trying to find information?
no, no, not really. But fortunately, 4 years later, I was reading our local newspaper one Saturday morning and noticed a little notice in it that was talking about a seminar that was going to happen about 3 hours after I was reading this.
Mm-hmm.
And it was going to happen 2 blocks away from my home. So I I thought, oh, great. And the seminar was called The Naturalness of the Supernatural. And I thought, oh, supernatural. Oh, maybe I can learn about that experience that happened to me with my aunt visiting. So, of course, I went to the seminar. And right at the very beginning, there were two wonderful women who were leading that seminar. And one of them was Diane Kennedy Pike, whose book I had read and had been very inspired by previously, and another woman, Arlene Lawrence. And they knew a lot about these sorts of things. So at the very beginning of the seminar, Diane said, "Is there anybody here who's had an unusual experience that they might still be wondering about?" And immediately I raised my hand and said, "Yes, I do." And I was so pleased and eager to be able to talk about it with somebody who would be receptive, I thought, to the whole idea. So I told about this visit from my aunt, and they said, "Oh, that's completely natural. Yes, of course we continue after we physically die. And we continue to look in on those we love who are still here. And very often we visit. Sometimes the people we visit are able to really see us, and sometimes they're not aware that we visit, but we do visit." So anyway, that was wonderful. And the rest of the seminar for that afternoon was full of other people giving testimonies of a similar kind, that they had visits from deceased loved ones. And so I felt very relieved and very reassured and extremely grateful for that experience. So then the next thing that happened was in 1980, when my own father died. And we had been close friends, but we never ever really talked about anything like about life and death. But anyway, he died quite suddenly, and he was back in Connecticut, and I was in California. So about 5 weeks after he died, I happened to be taking a course in psychosynthesis, and the course was given at a home in Santa Monica, California. And a couple of friends and I had driven in to take that course. And that teacher led us at the end of the class, led us in a lovely meditation. And the meditation was starting out with being aware of where we were in Santa Monica, California, and then expanding our focus to all of California and all of the United States and to the whole Western Hemisphere and to the whole Earth and beyond the Earth and out into space. And it's kind of an infinite open consciousness. And into that open consciousness that I was following in the meditation, suddenly there, about a foot in front of me, was my father's face and neck and shoulders.
Oh my gosh.
In full color, full vibrancy. And he was smiling, and his blue eyes were twinkling. He just looked so happy. And he said, nobody else in the room heard it, but I heard it telepathically. He said, "This is absolutely great." And laughed, and the most free, open laugh that I had ever experienced on him.
Oh, wow.
He was just so sparkly. It's so happy, so real, and so present. I mean, I could really feel that sense of his presence. He was really there. And yet he had died and he was in the spirit realm. So at that point, I started to just stream with tears of gratitude and happiness. And then the teacher of this class was bringing our focus back from way out in space back into this solar system and to Earth and the West Coast and Santa Monica. And the meditation was over. But I was so overcome with joy and happiness and wonder that I just kept sobbing and streaming with tears and crawled over on my hands and knees to to the teacher who had led that wonderful meditation and just said, "My father who died was right here visiting me. And this teacher understood that, and you know, certainly acknowledged that that was a real possibility, and he was happy about that. So anyway, I was so moved that I cried for the next 4 hours straight,
Oh,
even though my two friends I had driven in to this class from our homes, even though we had gone out to lunch and we were sitting in a restaurant, and I kept streaming with tears and laughing because I was crying, and laughing because I was crying in public in a restaurant. Thinking, what are all these other people thinking about this lady sobbing and crying?
and
And
chewing and crying and like
yeah,
swallowing, having some Coke or tea, and
right.
chewing and laughing and crying. Oh my gosh, that must have been quite a scene.
Oh, right. And the waitress a couple of times came over and said, you know, put her hand on my shoulder and said, "Is there anything I can do to help? Or can I call somebody for you?" I said, "No, no, no, don't worry. I'm having the most wonderful time. I am so incredibly happy that all I can do is cry." That feeling just had to come out. So that was absolutely wonderful. Then the next thing that happened in 1981, I was actually in Egypt. And one night, four other people and I climbed the Great Pyramid right up to the very top. And this was in the middle of the night to avoid the guards mostly.
That was my next question.
Not
Is why
allowed to
at
climb that
night?
pyramid, but we did climb it. And so we were sitting up there waiting for sunrise. And at the top of the Great Pyramid, there are a couple of big, big blocks that the pyramid is made of. But they're just sitting on the flat top of the pyramid. It's not a point. It's sort of actually, it's nowadays, now centuries, it's a flat surface with a couple of these big blocks. So they were just the right size to sit on, like you would sit on a stool. So I was just sitting there listening to the Arab prayer calls coming up from Giza down below. That was an incredible experience in itself. And it was still dark, and we were facing east, waiting for sunrise. And then we were going to climb down the pyramid and return to the hotel we were staying in. But while I was sitting there meditating, and it was really cold up there,
Mm-hmm.
I had a nice woolen scarf I had borrowed from somebody. And while I was just sitting there, suddenly I felt a warmth and a presence coming from my right side. And I felt that warmth and that presence embracing me. In other words, somebody or something was definitely there. So I was really warm on this one side and cold on the other side.
Wow.
And then I began to hear telepathically my father. He was visiting from the spirit realm again. And this time he stayed for a few minutes at least and told me about what a wonderful time he's having now. And he said, "I'm getting to travel all around the world and go to all the places that your mom and I never did get to go to, although they had traveled a lot to other countries. But I'm getting to go to all those places and explore anything I want and do all the learning I want to do." And he said, this time I was just slowing down my travels. He said, and I think this is wonderful, and we will probably all be able to experience this, that when you decide that you want to be at a certain place, you just think that thought and immediately you are there
Mm-hmm.
when
Mm-hmm. I've
you
heard that
are
many
in your
times.
spirit form.
Wow.
And then he said, so I've been going to everywhere I'd ever been curious about by thinking about it, and suddenly, boom, I'm there. And then he said, but this time I decided to really slow it down. So I was cruising across what I recognized as the African continent, North Africa. And I was cruising across the deserts. And then I came to 3 lumps sitting in the desert, and I got closer and I realized, oh, those must be the pyramids, the 3 great pyramids, and I must be over Egypt. And I came closer to that 3rd pyramid and noticed that there were little lumps sitting on top of the pyramid. Came closer and realized one of those lumps is my little Bobby. He had always called Bobby. He said, by Jove, my little Bobby sitting on top of the Great Pyramid. Good show. He said, just goes to show you, you can't keep a good girl down. And that was one of his expressions that he used now and then when I would achieve something or do something I was very, very happy about as I was growing up. He'd say, it just goes to show you, you can't keep a good girl down. So, so it was definitely my father. There was no question about that whatsoever. And so he told various things about his life in the spirit realm. And, just what a joyful, wonderful experience that is, and how happy he is. And then after a few minutes, I felt the warmth sort of withdrawing and felt his presence was gone. And again, I just sat there in wonder and gratitude and happiness that I don't think I sobbed that time, but just was just so grateful and pleased that that had happened. So then the next thing that happened is that a couple of years later is that my mother died. And she had died very suddenly in a car accident back in Connecticut, and I was in California. So I had not known, of course, that that was going to happen and had never had a chance to say goodbye or say any of the appreciations that I had always had for her. So after I did the funeral and various things back in Connecticut, I returned to California and called the woman who ran a meditation center out in what we call the high desert in Southern California, a retreat center that I had been to for a couple of weekend retreats. And I knew that that was a wonderful place and had very, very good vibrations. And it also had a meditation room, a big open room with just a carpeted floor, no furniture. And I asked if I could come up and sit in the meditation room. I had a very important process to do. So I took my best friend from back east who was visiting me, and we went to that meditation room out in the desert. And I sat on the floor, and my friend was down at the opposite end of this big room. She was Catholic, so she was happy to be there with her rosary beads and do prayers while I was doing more of a meditation at my end of the room. And what I did was something that I had learned previously from a spiritual teacher, that if you want a visit from somebody in the spirit realm, you can invite them. In fact, it really helps to invite them a few days before you think you will be ready for that visit. And then he said, picture her and in your own mind, call her name, and she will come to you. So that's what I did. Sitting there with my eyes closed, I just pictured her in any way that I could picture her, from all different angles and from different ages that I was.
Okay.
And calling her name, mom, and her her nickname and her full name, and just kept picturing her and calling her name, saying, please, please come to me. I really, really want to talk to you. And then it seemed, after just a few minutes of doing that, suddenly there she was. She came. Now my eyes were closed, but she was very vividly right there in front of me and very tuned in to me. So it was wonderful. She stayed quite a while, and I was able to, again, this was just in my mind, telepathic, because I didn't want to disturb my friend who was praying at the other end of the room. I was telling her everything I wanted to about how much I loved her and appreciated her being the mother that she was, and what a good, kind person she was, and just all kinds of compliments about her, appreciations I would have told her at the end of her life if I had been able to be there.
Mm-hmm.
So it felt very, very completing and wonderful to me. And then, as if that wasn't wonderful enough, then she said, she kind of gestured to me like, come with me. I want to show you something.
Wow.
So at that point, I must have left my body. That's the only way that I can think about it.
Okay.
Anyway, I experienced that I went with her into the realm where she was. And what I saw there was, first of all, her looking very much like she had looked in this life, um, although a bit younger, maybe
Hmm.
2 or 3 decades younger,
Hmm.
more like I had seen her when I was a child and a teenager. And then she pointed sort of behind her, and what I could see was kind of an arc of sort of um, soft golden light and a silhouette standing in front of that light, a silhouette of what looked like a petite, old fashioned woman. In other words, she had hair piled up and maybe some bows in her hair and a little collar that came up with little lace around it, little puff sleeves at the corner, tiny little waist, and a skirt down to the floor that looked like it might have had a bustle in it, and very small pointed shoes. And so she looked like a woman from maybe the 1800s or so.
Yeah, sounds quite Edwardian, that attire. Edwardian with the high collar and the puff sleeves and the tiny waist.
Yes.
Yes.
And very, very proper, very sort
Mm-hmm.
of prim, proper, elegant.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I didn't see her face. I just saw the silhouette because his sort of golden light was behind her. But then my mother said, this is what I want you to see. So then she showed me, and it was right as if I was there with her in her domain, not the physical earth
Right.
domain.
Yes. Uh-huh.
And so I was watching from the side, a few feet away. She showed me her standing and looking at that woman at close range. And I saw her looking and looking and suddenly saying, oh, and like fully delighted, are you? Are you? And the woman smiled and said, yes, I am Carrie. I am your mother. Now, Carrie, my mother's mother, had died when my mother was 3 years old. And so all of my mother's consciously aware life, and she lived into her 80s, um, all of her life, she had not had a mother, nor even a stepmother.
Mm-hmm.
And I had all the years of my growing up, I had been very sympathetic toward her because she didn't have a mother. And she knew that that was really sad for me, that I really related to that. and appreciated her more than ever because she was my mother and she was a very nice mother. And I do remember once when I was, probably a young teenager, I said to her, you know, how do you know how to be such a nice mother when you didn't even have a mother? And she said, well, I just try to be the kind of mother that I wish I had had. Isn't that lovely?
It really is. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
So
also
anyway, she showed
decision.
me this reunion with her mother, and
Mm.
they had this wonderful embrace and smiles and sobs. And watching this, I was so happy for them, especially for my mother, but for both of them, really, because that mother didn't get to bring up my mother if she, because of dying early. And so watching this, I started to sob with joy, gratitude, happiness. And the sobbing brought me back into my body, sitting on the meditation room floor. And that was my second episode of crying solidly for about 4 hours. And again, crying with gratitude and wonder and thankfulness and amazement that that experience had happened. And I can truly say it really, really happened.
Amazing.
So that was absolutely great. I just am so grateful still, all these years later, for
I
that
imagine you are.
experience.
Yes. And
Mhm.
can I ask you a question about that before you move on? I'm
Sure.
curious because this is a question that I know a lot of people have. How do you know? I mean, I heard you mentioning earlier you just knew that your father was there. You saw the detail, or your aunt or your mother. You see the detail in their appearance, you see expression in their eyes, you feel their presence that's there. And I just want to remark on that for a second because that's something I've heard a lot of people say that they felt the presence. It was like the person was literally there in the room with them, just like they had been
Yeah.
when they were alive. But then how do
Yes.
we know that our minds are not playing tricks on us? Like, how do we know the difference between that kind of visitation, this, in your opinion, your experience, versus having a vision or having a, not a dream, but a vision or an image of something as opposed to an actual visitation? Do you know what I mean?
Well, that's an excellent question. Um, for me, in those experiences, I could feel them. That is, I could feel the energy of them. Not that I felt the physical form, and it wasn't a physical form. They
Right.
didn't have a physical form, but um, I think what we don't realize necessarily is that with each person we are close to, we actually, it's very subtle, but we actually feel a frequency or a vibration. Uh, I mean, and I know I go through life without particularly thinking about that. Once in a while that comes to my attention, but that feeling of frequency or vibration in these visits was so familiar, it was almost palpable. And so that's what plus the visual and the auditory too. So that's what convinced me that these were real. They weren't imagination. They weren't visions. I think, they were real visits.
That's very
So just
interesting.
quickly to
Yeah.
go on another brief experience.
Mm-hmm.
My brother died after my mother had died 2.5 years later. And then I'd say it was a year or two after that that I was in a sweat lodge with Native Americans. And there was, I mean, that's certainly a very intense, interesting experience in
Mm-hmm.
itself. And there's usually a portion of the ceremony in a sweat lodge where they invite the ancestors or loved ones to come. And in that case, I suddenly was aware that above me and a little ahead in the top of this sweat lodge, which is very low anyway, that my brother was there. And my brother was looking at me and sort of smiling, and it kind of like his head talked a little bit like quizzical, like, what's my little sister doing in a situation like this? I said, well, yeah, well, that's just who you are, you know. And he said something to that effect. And so that was a very brief one. But a few years after that, I was in London with my husband, who was an Englishman, and we went to an afternoon matinee at a theater, and we parked a couple of blocks away from the theater. And I got out of the car, and my husband was in the trunk of the car, the boot, they call it in England,
Yes.
the boot of the car, and to fetch something. I don't know if it was a jacket or an umbrella or whatever, but so he had his head and half of his body in the trunk of the car, and I was just standing there looking around, and I noticed probably about 40 feet away on the sidewalk, there was walking a very, very elegant looking man. He was tall, stately looking, very elegant, very formal coat with a velvet collar and dressed up. And he was walking along, and I was thinking, oh, what an elegant gentleman that is. And then I looked at his face, and I recognized, oh, it's George, my brother.
Oh.
And he was looking at me. And when he noticed that I was recognizing him, he smiled and he nodded. And I looked around. It was a very wonderful moment. And then I looked around at my husband and said, come out of the trunk, quick, quick, quick. I want you to see something really special. But he was still fishing around for whatever he was looking for. So he missed it. And by the time he came out of the trunk and I looked again, my brother had just disappeared. But it was my brother. I know it was. And again, it was that feeling of presence, even though there was probably 40 feet or so between us in that instance. So that was really lovely. Now that's the last spirit visitation that I've had. But with each one of these, it has made me feel more convinced that, oh, yes, we absolutely do continue after physically dying. And we're very conscious, and we can go wherever we want to go to. We can come and visit the people we love. And also, since then, I've heard so many testimonies from other people about visits that they have had. In fact, one night I was visiting a therapy client of mine at her mother's house. The mother had lost her husband through death and was going through a really terrible, terrible time. I mean, we all go through grief when we lose a loved one through death, but this woman was just completely, she had been completely dependent upon that husband. And then he died, and she was having a really, really difficult time. And that's why the daughter, my client, invited me to come and see if I could do anything to help. So we were talking in the living room, actually two daughters and this older woman, the widow. And we were talking about the husband who had died. And two things happened while we were talking about him. One was that there was a big standing lamp on a big pole, and without anybody being near it, that pole started to sway and turned right over and fell on the floor. And then several minutes later, when we were still talking about him, we saw, so that was four of us witnesses saw a painting that he had particularly liked, a painting of a tiger, which was kind of done with metal pieces.
Okay.
And then glassed. It was on the wall, but pretty sizable frame, a heavy piece, in other words. And we saw that picture on the wall, allegedly by itself, lifting up from the hook, and that too fell on the floor.
Oh my goodness.
So the daughters, who were in their 30s, said, "Oh, it's Daddy." and the grieving mother just said, "Oh, isn't that annoying? Why would that happen?" Yeah, and the daughters kept saying, "It's Daddy. He's showing us that he's right here." And she just
Wow.
didn't believe it at all.
Did she have any theory? Like, was she able to say, well, the picture fell off because of this, or was she just not even going there into the
She didn't
conversation?
even go there. She was so caught in her grief. Anyway, the good thing is that I started to see her as a therapy client,
Uh,
and I think those sessions really did help considerably. And during those sessions, he came through. I guess he talked to her sitting in my office, and he said, "Yeah," he said, "You're not aware of it, but every night when you go to bed, you get in bed and you turn off the lamp, that I am right there kissing you on the cheek.
oh,
And I want you to know that because I'm right there loving you. I have not abandoned you." She
mm-hmm,
had felt abandoned by
mm-hmm.
him because he died. And anyway, that meant a lot to her. And later she reported that she is aware of it now when she goes to bed and turns off the lamp, that there's this sweet little sensation on her cheek. And she
Oh,
now is able to feel the love of her husband and that he's visiting her.
wow.
So that was really nice.
So how
No,
exactly did he come through? I mean, did she hear his voice? Did you hear his voice? How, I
she
mean,
heard his voice.
she heard his voice. Okay. So it
Yeah.
was telepathic again, telepathic communication.
Yes.
Okay.
And she was repeating it as she was saying. So, in other words, we were having a conversation like you and I are having right now
Mm.
and looking at each other. And then suddenly she said, "Oh, oh, I'm hearing him. Oh, oh." And I said, "Good. What is he saying?" And she said, "Oh, he's telling me about how when I go to bed at night and turn off the lamp, that he's right there kissing my cheek." Yeah, and a little bit more.
So, what kind of therapy were you doing at this point? Because I know that you started off as a so called regular therapist and then got more interested in, I want to say hypnosis therapy, and then it became regression therapy and so much more. So, where were you at in your personal and professional journey, since they seem quite synchronized actually? Where were you at the point that this happened and you were supporting
Well,
this?
I was still doing my regular therapy practice and continued to do that
Okay.
right up until um, about 4 years ago. I discontinued the individual counseling part of it and concentrated more on the regression therapy part of it. So from 1984 onward, I continued doing my regular therapy practice. And in that practice, on occasion, when it seemed to be called for, I would do a regression for one of my clients. And then in 1991, more and more people started coming to explore their extraterrestrial
Mm-hmm.
encounter experiences. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm still doing the past life regressions or regression for any purpose, and especially for extraterrestrial encounters at this time.
Yes, yes, and that's
Yeah.
a topic that you and I are going to get into on another episode of Barbara School. Today we wanted to keep it focused on death and your spirit visitations, and also just general perspectives on death. But I'm curious about your, wow, I did not know you had so many vivid, profound spirit visitations from your family that are just beautiful. I mean, what a
Yes.
special experience to have that, because not everyone gets to experience that. And that's one of the things I want to ask you about, is that it seems like it's, it's, I wouldn't say it's random, but it's interesting to me how some people try really, really hard to get in touch with their ancestors and have spirit visitation, to be able to see their loved ones, and they don't have success, even if they have the intention and they practice. Other people do nothing at all, and boom, it happens. So,
Yeah.
what do you think that's about? What's going on there? As to, because it seems like both people are, maybe not right away, to the people that are experiencing it as a surprise, as something of a shock. And like you said, your heart was pounding and your brain is trying to make sense of what's going on. But
Yeah.
nevertheless, you're open to it, and you're thinking about it, and you're conscious of the fact that this is a real thing. And then, paralleling that is the person who really wants to experience a visitation, and their intention is there and they're open-minded, but it just doesn't happen. So
Yeah.
what do you think that's about?
Well, I think there are a number of factors here. One of them is that sometimes when a person so vehemently wants to have a visit with a deceased person whom they have loved and been loved by, that the eagerness for it sort of makes it impossible to happen. In other words, when we're really wanting something, we're really focused on it, there is a tension um, about that, and that sort of forms a barrier to having the experience happen. Or it might be that the loved one is aware that the person wants that and is trying very hard to come through, but because of that sort of tension on the part of the person still here, that the loved one can't really break through that and have them aware that they really are there. So they may be there and the person just doesn't know it. So I think that's one factor. Another one is that it seems that the person in the spirit realm um, may be very, very involved in whatever they are doing in the spirit realm. Like there are many cases that I have heard of where people in the spirit realm are really off exploring a whole new aspect of reality or a different subject. Like, for instance, after my husband died a few years ago, and a medium was able to tune into him and said that he is busy exploring a subject he never explored in his life here, and that was the field of physics. And he not only was exploring and learning about physics, but he was teaching it to younger souls who were there in that realm. And so he's really, really engaged in doing that. So I've heard that a number of times about other people's loved ones, that they are busy working with children or doing something very worthwhile, or sending information back, through channeling
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
or whatever they're doing. And very often it seems to be, at least the situations I've heard about from other people, that whatever that spirit, the deceased person, is doing might be quite different than whatever their work was or their focus was here in this life. Because after all, when you think about it, we are an ongoing, continuing soul.
Mm-hmm.
And this lifetime that we're in now is only one of many, 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 many lifetimes and different kinds of experiences. And as the soul comes into a lifetime in a certain situation and has a certain focus for that life and certain kinds of experiences, that all adds, I have heard, to the growth of the soul. So the soul grows every time we have another incarnation. And I've heard also that it's very important in this long, long, long existence of the soul with many, many, many lifetimes in it, that we need, the soul needs to have us experience just about everything.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why sometimes we might come back as a person who's doing a lot of harm in one way or another in the earth. And then in another life, they might come back doing a lot of good. And I found out in the Association for Past Life Research and Therapies, where I had 5 years of training and then became very active with them and on their board and so forth. And we would, of course, discuss these things all the time when we would get together. And some of these past life regression therapists had noticed that there seems to be a trilogy of on a particular theme. For instance, in one lifetime, a soul might be in its earth life, might be a perpetrator of something very negative. And then in the next lifetime, they might come back and be the victim of that kind of negative perpetration.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then in another lifetime, here's where the trilogy comes in. In the third lifetime, they might come back as somebody who is helping the victims of that kind of perpetration to get through the trauma of that and to be functioning as a healthy person again. So I think that that's very, very interesting. And there are many examples of those of us who have done a lot of past life regression therapy, that that seems indeed to happen.
Wow, that's
Yeah.
fascinating. I've never actually heard that before, but this
Yeah.
trilogy, that is really interesting and also really lovely because it comes back to that idea that the universe, there's a Rumi quote that I love: what you want wants you, is the quote. What you want wants you. And I feel like, that is true. If we follow what we truly want, what truly calls us, which is always somehow directly related to the true nature of the universe, then we're having a relationship with the universe, and the universe wants to take care of us. It wants us to be whole. It wants us to, have all these experiences and grow and become more conscious. So that sounds like such a holistic way of doing it. You're the perpetrator, you experience it from that point, then the victim, and then the person who's outside of the situation, but helping to try to make
Yeah.
it better with compassion, with empathy, and the wisdom of learned experience. That's very wow.
Right. And then that same soul might, after that trilogy of three different lifetimes, might go on to explore a whole different aspect of things
Mm-hmm.
in the next lifetimes after that. I mean, there are different themes, there are all kinds of different experiences that we humans have. And so we take different lifetimes to do that.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. And actually, I just want to touch on what you were saying. I have a question about reincarnation, what your view is on reincarnation and spirits, the spirit visitations. You were touching on when people are trying really hard to reach a loved one and it's not happening. It could be because of the tension that's created by their eagerness. And the word
Yeah.
attachment came up in my mind, that they become
Yeah.
very attached to the outcome that they are assuming will happen, perhaps. And then the attachment to the desired outcome is preventing them from being open to however the outcome needs to reveal itself. That makes a lot of sense to me. So I'm
Yeah.
thinking about, we have all these attachments as well to our ideas of what death is, and what life is, what human is. We have very firm entrenched ideas about these things, and it's very difficult sometimes for us to come out of those firmly entrenched or ideas that we're attached to, and be able to think more flexibly. And so this question that I want to ask you requires some flexible thinking, because it's somewhat, I think, involves multidimensionality. And what I'm getting to is that I heard so much about how, consciousness is not something that is in a box. We can think of our body, for example, as being a kind of box, right? We are contained within the body.
Container.
Yes. And
Yeah.
so then we die, we leave the body dies, the body disintegrates, but the consciousness goes on, and we reincarnate, but we also can be a spirit. And so can you talk a bit about how someone could be a spirit? Is it possible, I guess, for someone to be a spirit and also being reincarnated? Is that something that you have any awareness of?
No, I think we are through everything here on earth, in a body and in the spirit realm. We are a spirit, we are a soul. Mm-hmm. So I think it's easy for us to think that we people here on earth have a soul. Mm-hmm. But I think it's really the other way around, that we are a soul through everything, whether we're here or whether we're in the spirit realm, or half in or half out, or whatever. We are a soul. And sometimes that soul chooses to have the experience of being incarnated on earth. Now, in more recent years, I have begun to feel convinced that the soul, if it chooses to, can be incarnated as a human being on earth. And if it chooses to, it can be what we consider to be an extraterrestrial on another planet.
Right. Okay.
And that more and more through the last maybe 10 or 15 years, I have been aware that more and more people are becoming aware of their lineage, that is, their ancestors, or I should say, their previous incarnations, some of which were as extraterrestrial beings. And that in those incarnations, of course, let's say being an Andromedan, let's just take an example of one of many, that's what reality looks like from that point of view. Mm. And they might or might not be aware that, way, way over there on planet which we know of as Earth, there are human beings. So some of the other beings are aware of us and come and visit us and so forth, and some of them are not. I mean, it's just amazing to think of all the different points of view that there are with conscious beings.
Yes.
And that we here, embodied in bodies on earth at this time, have more and more of an opportunity to expand our viewpoint of reality, and to include many, many other beings and many other planets, and many beings in other dimensions of reality. Okay. And that's what we basically are, is a soul in another dimension. And we come into the third dimension here and there, for what we call lifetimes or incarnations.
Okay, so do you think, I mean, I'm thinking of the example for example, of remote viewing, right? When someone is remote viewing, they're essentially, this is how I'm thinking of it, they send their consciousness out, right? Their consciousness can see something that is far away from their physical body. So you could say, in a sense, that their consciousness is in their body, operating from the body. The body is a tool or an antenna, mm-hmm. Operating from the body, but it's also somewhere else at the same time. So in your experience, Do you know if it's possible for a consciousness to be in spirit form and also be reincarnated at the same time? Because, you know, we know that, or I think we know that when we reincarnate, it's not like my exact personality and my exact consciousness leaves my body and then in a neat little package just goes boop and drops into another body for my next reincarnation. It goes
Yeah.
up, it becomes part of the all, it sort of accumulates other little bits of itself perhaps, and then comes as still me but not me at the same time into a new body and continues learning, right? So that is my
Right.
understanding of how consciousness essentially works, that we are everything and we are an individual as well, so that we can become everything and also become an individual. So do you think that it's possible for a spirit to be in spirit form communicating with loved ones and also be in a brand new body having a brand new life at the same time?
You know, I don't know that for sure, but I do hear that
Hmm.
from those who say they do know. That yes, you. So, in other words, this is something that people wonder about sometimes. If you have a loved one and the loved one dies and is a spirit form in the spirit realm, um, can you still communicate with that person if that spirit has incarnated again as another person? Well, I think there are different points of view that I have heard about that, and I honestly don't really know for sure from my own work, but um, apparently some people feel that is possible. That your loved one, whom you would like to communicate with in the spirit, who is in the spirit realm, uh, you can still do that if that person is, if that spirit is incarnated as another person
Hmm.
here in the world somewhere, because the theory is that not all of the soul gets reincarnated.
Right.
A certain aspect of the soul gets reincarnated. A certain aspect of the soul is still in existence in another realm.
That makes sense to me. I mean, I was kind of thinking about what you said earlier about the frequency or vibration that your spirit visitations had. They felt just like the person that you knew when they were alive. So it's like
Yes.
an imprint, like an energetic imprint or a fingerprint that still
Yeah.
exists in the ethers and is not the same as the fingerprint of the next body that they go into. So that makes a lot
Right.
of sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's probably much more complex than we know. I
Of
mean,
course. Yeah.
we're taking little tidbits, aren't we, of bits and pieces that we learn or that we experience and then try to sort of make a whole meaning out of it.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's lots more to learn that we haven't learned yet. And I think that that's very exciting. And I think that I'm very interested in the information that comes through from that spirit realm. For instance, Dolores Cannon has written a wonderful book called uh, uh, Conversations with Spirit.
Ah, yes.
And I read that fairly recently. And it's all done, the material comes from the regression work that she has done with people, taking them back to a past life. And then as the person continued in the spirit realm after death from that past life. And a lot of information has come through from that spirit realm through the regressions. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. To me, it does anyway.
Yeah, good. And so that's one source of information. Um, I think that there's quite a lot written by various people about this, communications from those who have physically died and
Mm-hmm.
are in the spirit realm. So it seems to be an incredibly vast experiences. Oh, and by the way, it's possible in this life to have a regression, to go back to when you were a spirit life. And I had this done for me back in 1983 by another woman who did a regression. It was in a group setting. Some of us chose to go back to why we chose to go into this lifetime. In other words, what was the main purpose? Why did we make the choices we made of who we would be born to, who we would know, which race we would be, which culture, which part of the world, etc. And so I participated as a client in one of those. And I'm smiling to myself because when she got to well, first of all, she said, notice the parents that you're going to choose to be born to, and notice the other people in the family who will be your family members. Notice the part of the world that you will be born into, what the influences are on you that you will have when you choose to do that. And notice kind of how your life will be unfolding. And then, so that all of that was a very interesting perspective for me. Everything about that made so much sense that came to me. And then here's the main part. She said, now notice what is the main reason why you're going to go into that lifetime. And that's all she said. And immediately, what happened in me in that experience of regression was, oh, my main purpose is to show people how it really is. And what I'm participating in right now, that's why I was smiling to myself a minute ago. And what that meant to me at the time in 1983, not knowing nearly as much as I have learned since then, but what it meant to me was to show people basically that we are these ongoing, continuing souls. And there are millions and millions and millions of souls, many in that spirit realm, many of them, of course, incarnated here on Earth. And which was a perspective that I had never had earlier in my life, you see. So not only did I want them to know about all these souls who eventually will choose to be incarnated as humans on Earth, but I was aware that behind me in the spirit realm, there was an enormous group of other beings. Now, in 1983, I did not know about the reality of any other beings living in the universe, extraterrestrials. I did not know that that was part of reality. But still, in that experience in 1983, I had a sense that behind me was this incredibly enormous group of souls who were somewhat different than we are, the realm that we're going to go to on planet Earth. And I didn't know what they were, but I knew that I was to bring that forward somehow in this life.
Wow. And then, of course, you had that. We're not going to get into this because we're close to the end of our almost hour now, but you have so many stories to tell. And the one that I'm thinking of is that voice that you heard when you went to a seminar. That voice was saying to you, Barbara, you're going to end up doing this. You're going to do regressions. We have to talk about that. Maybe next time we'll talk about that, because you really have received a remarkable amount of what seems like spontaneous experiences, and then also guidance and guided experiences that have led you into what you're doing now and have led you to feel this great passion for what you're doing and commitment to
Yes.
the importance of it. And, I'm just really happy to be having these conversations with you, Barbara, because I think you're wonderful, and I think your work is just incredible. And more people do need to know, especially now. And that's something you and I have talked about, right? That it's important for people to
Yes.
know now, more, maybe more than, not more than any other time on earth, but definitely more than in our recent memory. We're going
Yeah.
through such huge shifts and changes on this planet. And I feel like, just from my own little perspective, that this kind of information is crucial right now for people to know.
Oh, well, that's great. Yeah. And, there's so much death happening around the world. I mean, Ukraine is just one example, uh, devastatingly enough. But, and it seems like almost always there's some war going on somewhere on
Yeah,
this planet. Um, but yeah, I think more and more people, maybe true, more and more people are waking up to really wondering about these sort of quote unquote larger perspectives, larger aspects of reality.
I so agree.
Yeah.
And
And
learning how to
that's
comforting.
wonderful. A lot of people are kind of fed up with the way that it has developed in the world, and are beginning to really wonder, to awaken. And well, it's a very, very significant and interesting time to be on this planet.
Could not agree more. Could not
Yeah.
agree more. And I feel very fortunate to be able to have these conversations with you about it, and to share them with your audience. This video is going to be going up on your YouTube channel, and we want to get that YouTube channel filled up with lots of juicy conversations, and we're going to share them with other people also. But we wanted to close with mentioning your books. Your books are really important for people to read if they'd like to go into much more depth about what you're talking about. And I'm going to be listing those books underneath this conversation, in the notes of this conversation, along
Thank
with
you.
links so people can find them, and your website so people can find you if they'd like to book a regression. I had a regression with you, and that's a whole story. It went almost nowhere, but then you made it go somewhere, even though I wasn't able to go under. So that we just have a lot to talk about. In any case,
Yes,
thank you,
that
Barbara.
would be interesting. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And
Yes, yes.
I think important
I
because
think
you
so too. Yeah.
you you personally have experienced what many people would consider unusual things, but very significant things, and you have a very meaningful perspective on things because of your experiences.
I
And I
do.
think that's very worth bringing out.
Well, thank you, Barbara. Thank you. Well,
Yeah.
we will nerd out together, and share our experiences and the things that have happened with us. But I yeah, it has absolutely changed my entire life. It's changed me. It's changed every aspect of my life. It's changed how I see the world, how I see the universe, myself. And so yeah, it's quite something. I mean, I feel like it is not an accident that it seems like more and more and more of these experiences are happening for people around the world, but also that we have the internet to be able to share these experiences.
Yes. Maybe they've always been happening, but we didn't know it
That's what I'm
unless
wondering. That's
somebody
what I'm wondering
published
also.
about it. But yeah,
Yeah.
the internet is really opening up a lot for a lot of people. I think it's wonderful.
It really is. Like, the internet's good for something. It's good for something. So it's definitely
Oh,
good for this.
yes.
I mean, you're in the US, I'm in Toronto, Canada, and here we are able to have this conversation, able to share it with other people. And there's more coming your way, anyone who's listening. So Barbara, thank you. I just think you're wonderful, and I'm so glad we get to have these conversations, and I'm looking forward to doing a lot more of them. You have so much to share, so we'll take it bit by bit and release one a week. That is our goal. At
Okay.
least one a week. The audience, we're saying that for now. We're going to do our best, but definitely one a week. And And I hope that, this gets the response that we hope that it will, because this really is incredibly important information. What you said about there being so much death going on in the world, I think for me, we started off this conversation by talking about death. It really is not just the death of the body. Death is really about transition and change, and the difficulty and challenge and hugely different change in worldview and perspective and consciousness that can come with deaths that occur in our lives in so many different ways, not to mention literal death of the body. So this is a conversation we can continue talking about for ages, but for now, I'm just going to say goodbye to everyone, and thank you, Barbara. And there will be more coming. So we really hope that you enjoy this. And yeah, there's nothing more to say at the moment. Look for Barbara's website, look for her books. And thank you for being here with us, everyone.
Thank you. Many blessings.